All right, so this strikes me as a good segue to history. Can you talk about history, Carlin?
Not with qualifications, but just as a fan.
So you're not a historian. I know you're upfront about that, but your hardcore history, you do an incredible job of basically storytelling history with a little present day context. Do you see that as sort of the best way to get people to understand history?
It started off as a show for fans, which is what I am. I have a history degree, but it's a simple BA, and we used to do these shows where I assumed that the audience understood the story, and so we would just talk about the weird things in the story. I mean, I think the first show we ever did was 15 or 20 minutes, and of course the last one I just did was 6 hours. And so you can see I never would have done it if I'd known it was going to be 6 hours long or multi-part episodes. But then people would write us, and it wasn't the audience I thought was going to pay attention. They would say, I like those twists, or what we call them, sort of Twilight Zone musings. And they said, I like those, but I don't know the background. Can you give me more background? And as you well know, I always say Seinfeld wasn't Seinfeld for the first 10 episodes. Every show has to sort of evolve into what it's going to be. And we started evolving towards giving a little bit more information, then a little bit more information. Then we had to find out how a non-academically qualified person can transmit this story in a way where you could reasonably think you could trust it. And I came up with something we call, in shop anyway, audio footnotes, which is, okay, Carlin says something, then I back it up with something that a historian says, and then we point out, which has turned out to be one of the most fun things of the program for listeners, that historians don't agree. Because listeners always assumed, some of them anyway, that there was a history and that that's how it was. To find out that history is a little bit more like, from 500 years from now, somebody having an MSNBC or a Fox News version of it, that turned on a lot of them. And so the show evolved into what it is now, which part of what it does is show you how, we call it historiography in the history, but how history is put together and how they sort of, and how it can change over time. And so, what was the original question, Dave?
Well, I'll shift. I think you basically got it there. But I'll shift to this, which is how I started the top of the show, that I'm a firm believer that history repeats itself, which is why what I think you're doing is so relevant. Is there something historical that we can look to for our politics right now and go, yeah, it was kind of like that? Or is Trump really thrown in such a wild card here that there's nothing we can look and go, it's kind of close to that?
I've always said, I don't think history, the Mark Twain, I think it was Mark Twain who said history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. It's not that history is so cyclical, it's that there's a constant element in it, and it's us, right? It's human beings. What did Shakespeare say? All the world's a stage and all the people merely players. The tapestries change. But if you could pull people out of the past, other than the fact that they're going to seem like different cultures because they were raised in completely different environments, they're still people, right? If you measured them with sensory equipment, they're gonna score the same. And so that's why it seems similar. So when you look back, for example, at the fall of the Roman Republic, you have two things that are similar. One, human beings, so with the same passions and desires and foibles and all that, and then you have systems. So the reason people always look at Rome, the Republican, everybody thinks empire, but it's the Republic that's similar, is because when you have a government that is formed, because ours was deliberately modeled on some of those, so you have a similar system, and then you throw human beings into it, you're going to see things that are similar, because there are patterns that are going to reemerge. Does that give you any predictive value? Absolutely not. Right. History doesn't teach you how, for example, I love the right wing always tells you that, the Hitler and Munich and appeasement taught you can't do that. No, it doesn't. It taught you what you can do with Hitler in that situation at that time. The variables mess that up. So history doesn't teach you how to act, but it can tell you a lot about who we are.
So it's just humans, really. It's just humans within the time frame that they happen to live.
Humans and systems, right? Human systems and culture, because you can take people even now from different cultures. I mean, if you took people from a completely different culture right here, go to Central Africa and replace all the Americans tomorrow and take them and put them in Central Africa, take all the Central Africans, put them in the United States and say, here's your system, Donald Trump's your president, and you have a midterm election in 2 years.
Get going.
Do you think there's going to be a few differences in the voting patterns? And so you have to factor culture, systems, and us into the equation. But that's why history is important, because it really teaches you about us. As a species, through cultures and through time.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it. That there are historical events you have to know about, but really what you're learning about is just sort of the nature of being human.
And that's argued about, is there a human nature? But certainly, we have parameters within which most of us operate, and whether the culture expands those parameters over time, there's still, I mean, love is love, hate is hate, sex is sex. I mean, there's certain things that, I mean, we see the similarities in primates when you look at them now. So that's what connects you to an ancient Egyptian where almost nothing else would, right?
Yeah.
They're still people. And when you read, for example, the epitaphs that the ancient Romans wrote on the equivalent of tombstones of their children who died, it touches your heart today the way you can relate.
Yeah.
And the only reason you can relate is because if you took a Roman baby and put him in a time machine and brought him now and raised him as one of us, he would be indistinguishable, and vice versa.
Yeah.
You would like watching public executions for entertainment if I took you as a child and raised you back in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure we're going to get back to that. Not too. I mean,
There's a, you
have
could
you ever
say
seen
there's a
Running
version
Man?
of it we do now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We're not that far from it. You know, we really aren't. And by the way, there are parts of the world, Saudi Arabia, they're beheading people on the streets and plenty of people watch and cheer and all that. Are they that much different than us, or is their system, and I guess that's what you would argue, the system around them has just led them to cheering that, right? It's not
Culture. It's maybe
yeah.
culture. Systems lock you in, like a republic locks you into certain things. For example, in Rome, the part that just, you look at it and you just go, gosh, it looks so similar, is campaign contributions and money and favors with powerful people and the ability of the powerful to influence. I mean, the wonderful part of Roman Republic history for me is when you read about the attempts, for example, of the people who were known as the Gracchi. The Gracchi brothers are famous as the you would call them the champions of the poor today. Maybe like you would say the Bernie Sanders types or whatever. But what I love about reading the Roman history, and Rome is great because you have so much history that you can actually look at and study, is that the people at the time would say, that's not what they really believe. They're just trying to pander. It sounds so much like...
They were being paid off by the Koch brothers.
That's right. And so when you read it, you just go, that's a systems thing, right? Their system looks like our system, and because of that, you throw human beings, as they always are, into that system. The culture part is what makes it very different. But I mean, you can see echoes of who we still are today. Is it a predictive tool? Not at all.
Yeah.
But you do look at it and you go, gosh, we are interesting animals, and I see it over thousands of years of difference.
Yeah, I feel this question may come off a little too easy or a little too cliche, but are there a couple leaders throughout time that you look at as like truly special in their time?
Oh, this is
everything that you've said making sense, like accepting that a lot of it's human nature and the time they live in and the system they live in and all that, but were there a couple that somehow, or even one that just somehow within that moment did something truly special?
It's the age-old question, right? How much do the leaders push things versus how much do the trends and forces of the time period create an opening that someone fills? I mean, Trump is the perfect example of a trends and forces guy. I mean, we have a situation here where a vacuum was created that someone was going to step into, and he walked into it. He didn't push this, he didn't make this, he benefited from it, and he took advantage of it. He's the beneficiary of the trends and forces that, as we said earlier, have been 40 or 50 years at least in the making.
Yeah. Do you think he didn't push it at all? I mean, some of the tactics that he used
No,
over
no.
so you think it really was just...
and I think that's why he has to have the advisors he does to try to keep him in touch with the current trends as they are, and not just the current trends society, but the current trends amongst the people who are his supporters, right? He has to ask, Bannon, how will this play amongst the people? Because he doesn't know. I truly believe if you look at Trump, we always thought Trump was either a centrist Democrat or a centrist Republican. For him to have the most right-wing administration in anyone's memory is a bit of a shock. But he was able to read the lay of the land and know that there was this crowd that had been created by the dynamics of the last 40 years and the anger over the situation that he could play to that. Now, he doesn't know intrinsically how to play to that because that's not him. He has to ask, right? How will this move, react? So he's a trends and forces guy. When you look at people that push the envelope, you look for people who are wildly different. And that doesn't mean good necessarily. It just, I'm always impressed with the geniuses. That doesn't mean that a guy like Julius Caesar did not benefit from the trends and forces of his time, because he did.
Yeah.
But when you read about a guy like Caesar and you find out that he was able to sit there in his litter, going from place to place, dictating 3 letters at the same time. And you sit there and go, well, that's a really unusual human being. So you put those human beings in certain situations and you say, okay, that situation turned out in a way that it never would have turned out had it not been for that person.
Yeah.
So there's always interplay between the trends and forces and the individuals who are exploiting them. It's hard always to separate the line and say, okay, that happened because of that guy or that woman. So when you say historical figures, that I gravitate toward the horrible people, and I don't know why. But you look at Alexander the Great's the one I always look at, because to me, even with all the hyperbole, and there's a ton, he fascinates me. And he fascinates me because of even the different views that historians have over him. Either he was the enlightened example of a philosopher king, or he was a total butcher who's been totally mythologized later on. And to be able to examine the many facets. I mean, imagine yourself in a situation where 500 or 1,000 years from now, somebody on one hand is trying to explain you, and they're taking all of your qualities that are the best of you and portraying Dave Rubin as that. But then the other, okay, but then the other person takes all of the qualities that are the worst of you and creates a figure or a version of you that's and then multi-versions in between. That's why I can't. So when you say the most fascinating people, sometimes it's not what they did, but it's the many versions of them that you see, right? The many holograms of Alexander the Great, and dressed up in all the different forms, evil, terrible guy. Great, so I'm moved by the figures that are larger than life. And I enjoy watching how they've been mythologized too, because I think we do that today. I think liberals, for example, have mythologized Kennedy. Conservatives have mythologized Reagan. I've seen the Reagan thing in my lifetime, which I consider to be a wonderful teaching tool for me to then look and say, okay, I've watched how that happens. So now you can see, okay, it's obviously happened with all these other people in history too.
Yeah.
So,
do you think it's funny that with the Reagan thing, it's like he was obviously the hero of the Republicans for the last 30 years and the standard bearer of what a Republican
and deliberately
and
made
a
into
conservative.
that.
But then there was this thing in the last year where Democrats were saying a lot of nice things about him because they wanted to prove that Trump was not him. So it was like they took the guy that they hated the most to try to trick, I guess, Republican
It's a
base.
perfect example of why it was done.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, we create a metaphor. Right, we create an image, and listen, we're singling out Reagan, but this is why I like it. It's the human thing to do. We did it with Alexander too. You take a person, and as soon as they're gone, you can easily compress them into a two-dimensional version of themselves, and then you can use them as a symbol for what you want them to represent. Right, and if you could bring these people back now and show them in the 360 degrees of the human that they really are, it'd be amazing to compare them to the mythology that's been created about them. And when you see it done to one person, it allows you then in your mind's eye to understand how the process works all throughout history, and not just with good people, but sometimes with evil people too. I mean, if you go read Mein Kampf, the very first history show we did was asking whether or not Alexander the Great was a better or worse person than Hitler. And the attitude in it was that if the stories are true, we'll throw the big asterisk, if the stories are true, maybe Alexander the Great was killing all the people he killed because it made Alexander the Great a bigger historical figure. Whereas when you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's a twisted human being, a product of his time, but he thinks he's doing something good.
Right.
If you think you're doing something good, does that make you a somewhat less evil, that's a good way to put it, than the guy who killed all these people because it made him a bigger figure? Mm-hmm. So that's a heretical thing to say and a blasphemous thing to say, but the point is that do human beings literally go out to commit evil, or sometimes do they go out to commit good, or are these just byproducts or mistakes or accidents of history?
Right, and to be clear, you're not saying Hitler was good. You're saying that
never said Hitler was good. Right?
I'm just going to clean
Hitler.
that. Yeah, I'm going to clean that up.
Okay.
For you. You're saying that this twisted thing that he himself believed it was good. Yeah.
Here's what we need to do. We need to get rid of all the Jews because it's going to make things better for everybody. Does that make him better than the guy that gets rid of all the Jews because the more Jews I kill, the bigger a figure I am?
Right.
The whole question is weird.
Right.
But that's what history allows us to play with and ask ourselves, as we mythologize, change, and as many decades pass and we forget either the good points or the bad points of these figures, how do we create a figure that, if we could go back in time and see them as they really were, we wouldn't recognize the real figure anymore. Kennedy's been mythologized. I mean, this is a guy who served 3 years in office. Other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was crazy how good he performed in that, if you went back and really elected the guy today, how many liberals would be happy with him? Just like if you really brought Reagan back today and put him in front of conservatives, he might look like a guy that you wouldn't vote for because he wasn't conservative enough.
Right, that's the funny thing. I think for Kennedy, it would be you'd get some classical liberals and conservatives voting for him, but the left would not be thrilled with JFK.
That's right. But the myth is different. And the myth serves purposes. You're able to put a wonderful bust, or you could put a picture of them at your convention as, look at the wonderful heroes the Democratic Party's had. We've had Wilson, we've had Roosevelt, but would you want any of them today? Maybe. Yeah. Maybe not.
So it's almost like we need Greek mythology in
heroes.
In our system. We need or we need Marvel superheroes or something that represent these things, because the people behind them are all flawed and as screwed up as the rest of us.
Look at Martin Luther King. I mean, this is the thing about Martin Luther King I always try to explain to people, is that here you've created somebody that we can have a Martin Luther King Day, which is like the George Washington chopping the cherry tree down day, right? People forget Martin Luther King. You go look at the speeches that he was giving. He was harsh on the American system, right? What did he say? Something, the focus evil of the modern world. I forget the exact quote, but it's one of those things that gets really downplayed when we talk about the mythology. You know, they play up the sides that serve the purposes of us now and play down the parts where the man was really revolutionary. In fact, my favorite Martin Luther King speeches are the stuff we never talk about anymore, because they're really edgy. But edgy doesn't serve the purpose of hero worship. And that's how we always are.
Yeah. Do you think he evolved out of that stuff, or you saw it also as just a way to go mainstream too?
No, because here's the thing. We forget now. Mainstream is what, when King is marching, for example, we forget that civil rights was not something that everybody was going, yes, we should have civil rights. It wasn't that way. To simply be asking to get rid of separate but equal in the South is radical. Yeah. And they're turning fire hoses on you and setting dogs on you. And a good 40 to 60% of the country is thinking, those are bad people. Today, if you showed the same thing today, the number of people that would say, oh my God, that's horrible, would be in the 90 percentile. But that's because we've moved on, and in part because of what those people went through. In other words, Martin Luther King is more of a hero now because the times have changed, in part because of Martin Luther King, so that he's not seen as the radical he was. Go read the things the FBI said about him. In their minds, he's a communist. Go kill yourself was what the FBI letter said to him. Go kill yourself. I mean, can you even imagine today? So what happens is when we have these figures that are radical and controversial at the time, if they were ahead of their times, then they end up looking like much more banal figures than they really were. Martin Luther King was, revolutionary is too strong, but edgy. And in a good way, in my opinion. But now, of course, he looks edgy in a way where we've all gone that route, right?
Right.
At the time, there were a lot of people that didn't like his stance. And if you think King's edgy, look at Malcolm X. You know?
For sure.
By any means necessary.
So as someone that talks about the Constitution and the separation of powers and all that stuff, and you just mentioned separate but equal.
Right.
It's incredible to me, you know, in our Constitution where it says all men are created equal, and yet these same people had slaves. Eventually we freed the slaves, and then we got to a place where we were allowed to have separate schools, but if they were equal but separate, then that was okay. But is that arc always bending towards justice? Because I know it seems like right now everyone is more at each other's throats than ever before, and angrier and more divided and all that stuff. But I would argue, and I've had a lot of guests come on and argue this, that basically things have gotten a lot better. And we're always going to have problems, for sure. And that doesn't mean we can always be better. But that really things have gotten a tremendous amount better, in large part because if we were just governed by the Constitution, it's a pretty great thing.
I require clarification on the word better.
Better in that we are a more just society. In that
the United States specifically?
That the United States specifically has consistently become a more just society every decade that has gone by, basically. I'm sure we could probably find some setbacks. Maybe you could think
This is going to be a person-to-person question.
But basically, yeah.
Okay, the Dan Carlin answer, because mine's going to be different than anybody else's maybe, is that...
I want you to speak for everybody.
Well,
Now?
Okay.
I thought the first 50 minutes you were talking for everybody. Now you can just speak for Dan Carlin.
Here's the way I look at it. When I grew, I think our expectation levels are set at an early age. And so the era I grew up in, the 1970s, I consider to be the high water mark of, for example, things like journalism. And as a person who came up in the journalistic profession, that's my background, I have a high-minded, idealistic, and maybe even inaccurate historical view of how I see journalism. Because if you look at journalism throughout most of the country's history, it starts off in revolutionary times as absolutely, they're just yelling awful things to each other in different papers, and they, personal attacks, and that's why you have libel and slander laws and all.
People don't realize that.
Yeah, no, it's awful.
That it used to be a lot
terrible.
of that. People go, they speak to each other so horribly now.
It was awful.
Yeah.
And then you go to the periods, you look at the 1930s and 40s, and it's all corporate stuff, right? A lot of the stuff is just fed to you from, and then you get to the 1960s, and even then, it's still what we would call today almost propaganda. Then you get to the 1970s. The post-Watergate period is this little teeny era where it was the way I think it should always be. And if I'm speaking for everybody, it's the way it should always be. Where it was rough. As a matter of fact, a listener once told me, and he sent me the speech, Katharine Graham, who was the editor of the Washington Post, had to give a big speech after Watergate to all the bigwig people and say, don't worry, this isn't going to be a trend. We're not going to be this expose everybody all the time, because it was so unusual. But I mean, if you go look at 60 Minutes, the way 60 Minutes used to be, they used to say the worst thing that could happen to you was to see Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes walking up your driveway, right?
Yeah.
Run. We don't do that anymore. And so for me, if we had the kind of media that we had in the 1970s, so much of what I disagree with today could not stand. It's like the idea of sunlight being the antiseptic. If we talked about it, and if we had the problem with media fragmentation, is that we're not all seeing the same things. Now, is that good or bad? It's something you weigh. But in the water cooler discussions in the 1970s, we were at least all talking about the same things. And you might say the Washington Post lies like a dog, but we're still talking about the story that they wrote and debating it. So when you say things are getting better, it depends on how you define it. The iPhones are certainly better than they were in the 1970s.
Right. But I guess we're talking about two different things. So I was purely talking about just the rights of the human beings, of the citizens of the United States. You think are worse.
And it depends on if you ask folk from cultural minorities in this country, I think it's better. Yeah. Because they've been progressing at a different pace.
Right.
But if you say the rights of Americans in terms of, the word liberty is a funny word. Charles Austin Beard said decades ago that all you need to get a reputation as a dangerous radical these days is to go around spouting the sayings of the founding fathers. I would say that the same thing would get you on a domestic terrorism list these days. And yet, words like liberty used to be used in a real sense. Now, what does liberty mean? Well, you could talk to 20 different people and get 20 different definitions. But it doesn't mean what it used. In the 70s, we had this concept, and it might not jibe with the reality of the 1970s, but the attitude then was that they're always going to get better, right? Your rights are going to get better. You're going to have more rights. All these things, and they're not. The 1970s, in terms of personal freedom and all these things, not only was it better, but the concept in the culture was different. I would argue that if you grab a 20-year-old today and then talk about some of the things we used to think when I was growing up should be part of your rights and said, would you like to live in a country like that? A decent number of them are going to go, no.
Right.
So I would even say that the concept of the kinds of country I would like to see might have been bred out of my countrymen because of the changes in the culture. Government is much more powerful, insular, secretive. I mean, the secrecy in government is a disaster. Mm-hmm. How do we go for that? We go for it because, one, we don't have a press exposing it and talking about how outrageous it is, but two, because the cultural norms put up with it. We are much more scared than we were in the 70s, which is part of that's another reason the 70s were so great, because we had just exited an era where people were as afraid of communism then as we are of terrorism today. And in the 70s, we stopped being so. It was the beginning of the period where all of a sudden people would say, oh my God, the commies are going to come. And you'd say, no, they're not. And yet the taking away of the fear was like dispelling something. And after September 11th, and remember it started, we had World Trade Center bombings in 95, we had the Omnibus Anti-Terrorism Act of 96. I mean, this has been people forget those things, but 9/11 was a capsize point.
Yeah.
We are too afraid to have the kind of freedom and liberty that I grew up expecting, not only that we were going to have, but that every decade it would get better. When you say getting better, that's how we felt in the 70s, and yet I would say to you, Press freedom is worse. Personal freedom is worse. Our conception of what the government should do is worse. The secrecy is worse. So, I mean, it depends on how you define it, obviously.
Yeah.
If you are an African American in this country, I think things are better today than they were in the 1970s.
Yeah.
But so depending on where you're looking and what your viewpoint is, but my argument is from the standards of the Constitution and all that, the 1970s may have been the high watermark of American self-image of what these things should be.
So that's interesting. So that it went from sort of real personal liberty, which we've come a long way.
The
And
right
you're
to
acknowledging,
behave the way you want to, as long as you weren't hurting someone else.
right, so that we've come a nice way. What we've lost in the course of that is that we've allowed government to get bigger and spy on us, and at the same time watch the press kind of crumble around us.
But it's
and
our
all
doing.
that.
I
But
blame.
yeah.
I blame. And here's
You got to look in the mirror. Yeah.
I used to call something the Pinocchio effect when it comes. Remember that Oliver Wendell Holmes had defined the limits of liberty on the court, and he said, "The right to swing your fist ends where the other man's nose begins." And I had asked the question, what if the other man's nose is continually growing, right? In other words, if you say you can live the way you want until you harm somebody else, what if you decide things harm you now that didn't harm you before? For example, if you play your music too loud and I live next door to you and I can't sleep, you're directly impacting me. That's a direct imposition on my freedom. So you shouldn't be able to play your music that loud. If, on the other hand, I smoke cigarettes and my insurance company is going to have to pay for me if I get sick, which is going to raise your rates.
Right.
Did I really impact your rights? Well, people will say, I can impact your rights because you're costing me money. Okay, well, that's the equivalent of the nose growing longer. I call that wallet rights because it's different than a direct inhibition on your rights. It's an indirect one. Now, the problem with that is if you're clever, you can connect point A to point B on anything.
Yeah.
Once you say if it costs you money in a society as interconnected as ours, then Oliver Wendell Holmes' whole proposition goes out the window because then everybody's actions cost you something.
Right.
So you can't swing your fist at all.
Right, you'd be out there grabbing
That's
cigarettes
right.
out of people's mouths,
That's
stopping
right.
them from
And
drinking.
so that's become the problem. Once we decided that instead of a direct challenge to your right to live the way, an indirect challenge is an imposition and becomes cause for limiting you, then we've destroyed the entire idea that you have any personal liberty that you can call your own, because everything you do impacts at least my wallet somehow.
So that's interesting. So let's just quickly, before we wrap up, go back to the example of the music, because I think it's a perfect example of where we can talk about government intrusion and personal rights and all that stuff. So if my next door neighbor was banging on the piano all day long, even if they were playing great classical music, but it was bothering me, I would eventually go next door and say, if you wouldn't mind, maybe from these hours, blah, 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 please play
But you're telling him that you've impacted my rights.
Right, I'm saying this is my right in my own home to live here peaceably and not be
and the golden rule, you wouldn't like it if I did it to you.
Right, and I would use something like that, but it would be me expressing my thoughts and then hopefully them hearing that. Now, what a lot of people would say is, no, they would say, maybe you try that, but if they don't, well, then what's the next step? Do you go to your local congressman or councilman and say, we need some sort of noise law passed? And then all you're doing really is just expanding the government to then control what should be done as an interpersonal thing. But sometimes you can't win all of those What if the guy just says, well, go fuck yourself. Sorry, buddy. Then how do you balance liberty and not an intrusive government?
This gets back to my views on not educating the American populace on what their freedoms are and what they mean. We don't do enough. I mean, liberty is a bad word now. I mean,
yeah.
And yet, look at your founding documents. It's the number.
I like the word liberty.
Right. Okay. But no one even knows what it means anymore.
Yeah.
So, for example, I always connected it to the golden rule. The amount of freedom you're willing to give your fellow human being in this country is directly proportional to what you get. So you're saying, God, that music really disturbs me, but you know what? The guy enjoys it. I'm going to cut him some slack until 8 p.m. and then I'm going to go to him and say, hey, buddy, you know what? After 8 p.m., can we cut it off? And that's a fantasy way to live because human beings aren't that way.
Right.
At the same time, there is a golden rule aspect to liberty, and if you get too restrictive of your fellow man, you're in effect restricting yourself.
Right.
Now, people don't understand this because we don't, if you go look at the founding documents, there are eras, right? And eras, certain things become big. In this era, we talk about terrorism a lot, and we get granular with it, and we examine it. In that era, liberty was big, and all these great writers, the John Locke's, and all these people we celebrate today, the Thomas Paines, they were examining that question and their version, by the way, what they meant when they said liberty is different than what even you and I are talking about today. They had an 18th century political concept of what it meant. But in the 70s, to get back to what I like to call the high watermark of our concept of these things, this idea of your right to live your life the way you see fit was pretty darn strong. And that became restricted due to this idea that people were going too far. And in my view, I have a hard time with going too far in your rights to live your life, especially if you're not directly, not wallet rights, not directly impinging on my freedom. For example, we are less tolerant as a species. I mean, look at how angry people get at smokers, for example. I understand it, especially if it impacts your health. At the same time, there's no sense amongst, and I don't mean to single out anybody because we all do this in our own ways, but to not understand that impacts you. They'll say, well, I don't smoke, so I don't care what I do to those people. Yes, but it impacts the general idea about what you're allowed to do.
Yeah, they are doing something legal.
Well, and
you may not like it.
We all do something that someone doesn't like, and the way we've become these ways is very selfish about our rights. If I do it, it's important. If I don't do it, and it costs me money, to hell with that. There's a general concept, though, that we should teach in schools about how liberty is a give and take thing. So
then what do you do when they keep taking? So going back to this guy, so now it's 8 o'clock, I've expressed it kindly and nicely to him. 8 o'clock rolls by, he's still slamming on the piano.
I do think that's the swing my nose fit. That's when maybe you do have a noise ordinance. And that's why I'm not one of those libertarians who would say you don't need government. All these things can be handled between individuals. No, you can't, because some people are jerks, among other things. And some,
So that's what I was trying to get to. The line between, I guess, in this case...
Which is why I'm not a libertarian,
It's libertarianism and classical
liberalism. And people
liberalism.
can't take care of themselves. When you get to libertarianism, that's my other problem, is that I don't have as much faith as they do, that if you took away the supports, shall we say, that people necessarily can take care of themselves. I can. You can.
Yeah.
But not only can not everyone take care of themselves, great English, but not only can not everyone take care of themselves, but there are people that do absolutely vital jobs in our society that are not profit-centered things. And you look at the caretakers who and they make nothing, and you look at them and you go, yeah, but what are you going to do when you need a caretaker? Society doesn't allocate resources, and never has, by the way. This is, again, we're talking about fantasy here and theoreticals, but doesn't allocate resources that way. So when I'm a libertarian when it comes to civil liberties. When you talk about how you organize society, I always wonder about what I call the losers, and I don't mean that in the terrible, but there are winners and there are losers. And if you have too many losers in your society, they will destroy your society. They will make you feel their pain. I did a show once I called one, What About the Losers? I called the other one the Revenge of the Gangrenous Finger. And I said, listen, if you're a human, if our society is like a human body, and this finger gets diseased, you may say, to heck with this finger, who needs it? It's a small finger, and well, you can get away with that for a while till it gets bad enough, and then it will make you feel its pain. There's a reason the French Revolution happened, right? There's a balance and a stasis that every society needs, and there's a certain amount it can go before it gets out of balance. If you say, I have an ideological template that says it's every man for himself, and enough people don't make it, they'll get rid of your ideology.
Yeah.
And they'll destroy your society.
So would you basically say that classical liberalism is just sort of a more realistic version of libertarianism? That's sort of where I've come around, that I would consider myself a classical liberal because I'm agreeing with you on this, that I see some use for the state. There are some things that the state has to do. And I want lower taxes, but I understand that you have to be taxed.
Everything is a balance.
Yeah.
And the problem is that because conditions change, you have to continually be rebalancing. And the likelihood in a system like ours, where your views and my views are not what the politics, this is where the corruption comes in. And I want to use the word corruption because when we talk about campaign finance reform or something like that, it sounds like an issue to be argued. When you say corruption, there is no good argument for corruption.
Right.
And what I always say is every government is corrupt because you can't help it. But if you go look at the U.S. government actually puts out an index of corruption, believe it or not. And at the top countries are the least corrupt countries, and at the bottom you get to these kleptocracies, right? And stuff like, so everything's in between. Even the most clean, well-run governments have some level of corruption. And every government can function with a certain amount, right? But there's a tipping point. Somewhere on that scale, you get to a number where it doesn't work anymore, where everyone has to be bribed. The United States used to rank at a level much higher than we rank now. At what point do you get to a place where it doesn't matter what Dave Rubin wants or Dan Carlin wants, you don't get what you want. For example, all these politicians, you know where the real flaw in our system is a politician can promise anything they want. There's nothing that holds them to it. You have more protection in a handshake relationship with your gardener than you do with a person running for president, because they get into office and change their minds. The only reason you voted for them is what they told you they do.
Right.
What if they don't do it? Well, you could say, well, I won't vote for them in 4 years. Then in 4 years, you'll get to a place where it's them against another
Some
idiot.
other nut.
That's right, and you can't, and you hate them both.
Right.
And what are you going to? But that's where the two parties kill us, because they put people. I mean, this election is the best example you'll ever see. How many people held their nose, regardless of who they voted for, and voted for someone they didn't want because they really couldn't stand the other guy even more, or the other gal even more? Who said that they get to pick your choices? And they say, well, you had a whole primary process. Yes, but who got to be in the debates? And who decided that? A commission made up of half Democrats and half Republicans?
How is it that we let the Democrats and Republicans decide that the third party could only get in at 15% nationally? We let the other two parties
Okay, but once
decide.
again, we get back down to the level.
Yeah.
We let them.
Yeah.
We let them. And this is, you know, I said it, and people hate when I do this, about looking at the bright side of some of these things, but sometimes you don't get the right reforms in government until somebody crosses a line. Was Watergate a good thing for the country or a bad thing? Well, when President Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, he said, our long national nightmare is over. But we got reforms after that are the best reforms we've had in 40 years. So was Watergate worth it? So you say to yourself, okay, if you have to fall off the ledge for us to fix something in this system, should we fall off the ledge? Okay, only if it gets fixed, right?
Not if
So
it's a
that's-
bottomless
If you have a
pit.
constitutional crisis, it's a great thing if afterwards you solve things. It's a bad thing if you lose.
Yeah.
And so that's with Donald Trump, I can sit there and go, God, you know, when they talk about a constitutional crisis, just hearing the word constitution sounds like a reform, right? We're talking about it, but what if you lose? So in that sense, I'm torn between, if you had elected Hillary Clinton, all those people that are upset with Donald Trump, you would have gotten more of the same, and I would suggest it's 50 to 60 years of slouching towards unconstitutionality. I mean, to me, Donald Trump looks like chemotherapy. He could kill us faster, or he could be something that prompts the equivalent of Democratic, and I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean Democratic antibodies.
Yeah.
He reminds us why authoritarianism is dangerous and what could happen. There's a lot of people who don't think about politics at all. We have lives. We have things in our own life that we have to focus on. I mean, you want your country to run on autopilot, and you want it to run well on autopilot. But in a system of representative democracy, if the people don't flex their muscles long enough, things get wiggy. Been 40 or 50 years since we've gone out there with our feet and told government, no, you can't do this. And it takes, you know, they talk about a women's protest with millions of people, and that's great. But that doesn't work. It has to be protest.
Now-
You
and
have
now
to
what's
maintain it.
Yeah.
And then they listen. But you could lose. And if we lose, then you have to have a plan B country.
Well, speaking of Plan B, I think we're going to have to do this again to get to some of the Plan B stuff, because I always say it's a good interview if I don't have to look down once. And I didn't. And
Did I let you talk, Dave? Did I give you any
I
time
said
at
a
all?
couple
Any
things.
space?
I cued you nicely, and you took a bit. This was really a pleasure. I mean, this is what it's all about. This is what I've tried to bring to my audience is let's really figure some of this stuff out. Let's not pretend we know things that we don't know, and let's figure out how we're supposed to be governed and how to look at the past so we can figure out the future. So this is exactly what I like to do.
Thank you for having
I
me.
thank you for coming in. You're going to stick around and do a little rapid fire for
Sure.
our patron people. And for more on Dan, check out Common Sense and Hardcore History at dancarlin.com.